And Nina Mani, everyone. Mani, aye. We acknowledge and pay respects to the Gardner people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on today. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Gardner people to country, and we respect and value their past, present, and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. We're also going out to the rest of South Australia as well, online. So we also pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal people attending from other areas or in other areas of South Australia. My name is Rod Nancarrow. My role is as Executive Director with Educators SA, and I've got the job of emceeing tonight, which is an interesting one. I'd like to welcome everyone here, both online and in person, on behalf of the board and our member associations of Educators SA. I'm sure nearly everyone in the room and online would know about Educators SA, but just in case, we are a community of 60 educator professional associations, all of which are volunteer-led and all of which are focused on supporting colleagues and continuing to grow the profession. If you don't know anything about Educators SA, please go on the website. But collectively, those 60 member associations connect with about 15,000 educators throughout South Australia, and they play an incredibly vital role. They're subject associations, leaders associations, early years associations, environmentalists, and so on and so on. I could keep going on. But if you're an educator and you really want to engage and associate professionally, there's certainly an association for you. When we ran this event in 2018, just prior to that election, we had about the same number of people that are attending today. The big difference is, as I said, is about half or a bit more than half people online. And it's a real factor of COVID, the COVID period, that we're all sitting here spread out across this room, but also that we've had to quickly learn to do things online. And I think it's great because we've got a lot of people in the country and a lot of others who otherwise would not be able to be part of it, able to attend today. So welcome everyone online, and we hope it's a great experience for you. It means we have to be very static, so our speakers actually have to stand still because the camera is pointing directly at this podium. The structure of tonight is very simple. What we've decided this year is a bit different from last year. We've invited the two people who are most likely to be our Education Minister post-election. Now, we know there's no guarantees, portfolios change, but at the moment, our two speakers are the ones who are most likely to lead education and govern education. So we thought it's absolutely critical that as an education community, we have the opportunity to listen, to personally consider, and to then be able to make our own decisions about which direction that we would like to vote as educators. The structure will be each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, and then there'll be a series of questions which I will ask as MC for about another 15 minutes. And these questions have all been sent in by people who are attending today. I think I received well over 60 questions. So your question, if you send in, may not be asked, or it may be asked in a blended way with other questions. So please appreciate that and understand that we've had to do it in a way that's going to capture the biggest interest across the education community. We're thrilled to have both the Minister and Shadow Minister here with us today, and I think it's an indication from both of them that they're really committed to educators, that in this incredibly hectic time, they're prepared to give up time to be with us and share their views and what they are offering. We've also got a range of other people in the room, from association presidents, association members, members of educational organisations, presidents of unions, and so on and so on. And I think it's really representative of who we are as an educator community, which is dynamic, interested, and committed. We're also thrilled, and this is important from our point of view, to have our sponsors, Credit Union SA, represented here today and represented up there. And we've got Joanne Skane here from Credit Union SA, and they have become an integral part of the education community. And as I say so often at everything I talk to, it's really important, I think, for us to support people who support educators. So always keep that in mind, and we're very grateful for your support. This time last week, I was feeling very positive about my future. Someone might know why. I'd convinced myself I was going to win the 120 million. Sadly, this week, my financial future isn't quite as bright as I'd hoped. So today, I'm very much focused on the future of education because that's something that's really precious with us. I want to emphasise this is not a political event, it is a professional event. So it's not about a town hall meeting and raise voices, it's about us as professionals having the opportunity to listen, think, consider, weigh up, to put aside our personal political preferences for a while, and as educators, consider which policies we think are going to have the biggest impact on education for the next 4 years. So in that context, I'd like to, well, it's my pleasure to invite the Minister for Education, the Honourable John Gardner MP, to talk with us for 15 minutes and then to respond to some questions. So would you please welcome the Minister to the stage?
Well, thank you very much, Rod, and also acknowledge Lisa Jane as the President of Educators SA. I'd like to begin by acknowledging we're on Gardner land, and I know that everyone here respects the relationship the Gardner people have with this country. I was thinking earlier about, and Rod sort of touched on a couple of these aspects. 4 years ago, we had a forum a bit like this. It was a bit different. We had the Xenophon Party and we had the Greens, and they got time as well. I think we had about 10 minutes less each from Liberal and Labor. So we've created more time for us, less time for those other parties that are important and their views are important, but they've got other avenues. And I think Rod framed that well. And then there's, of course, a little bit more time for refreshments for those of you at the end of the sessions. So I think Lisa, Jane and Rod, congratulations. And thank you very much for inviting Blair and myself. I acknowledge Blair Boyer also. I think he might be here later. Oh, Blair's here as well. So my parliamentary colleague, Blair Boyer. I committed to Blair the last time we were together that I wouldn't do the Cardinal Williams quote again in the near future. He's heard me say it about 6 times, as have all of you, so I won't be doing that again tonight. 4 years ago, I was a shadow minister. I'd been shadow minister for about 2 years. It was very much an introductory session at that time. I'd met some of you, not all of you. I spoke at that time about the things that I thought were important, reforms I thought were critically important, and that you could expect from a Liberal government were we to be elected at that election. I talked about the transformational proposition of moving Year 7 to high school, the literacy guarantee package of measures. I talked a bit about the commitments to languages and music in schools and a number of those matters that we had. And critically, I think, the reforms that we thought were necessary for vocational education and training in schools, what at the time we were calling flexible apprenticeships and traineeships, and which we now call flexible industry pathways because the acronym is far more appropriate. And to the letter, we've delivered on those commitments. I'd like to think that we've delivered in the spirit of them as well. And I'd like to think we've either met or possibly even surpassed expectations of people, what people might have to expect from a Liberal government, given that there hadn't been one in South Australia for 16 years in South Australia. So in the last 4 years, I hope that many of you have heard me, have gotten to know me a bit. Maybe you've heard me speak on a number of occasions. Forgive me if I repeat myself. You possibly have some idea of what to anticipate should we be re-elected based on what you've got to know of me over the last 4 years. And certainly you'd have some idea of what to expect. I don't want to dwell on the past and just focus on looking backwards. Tonight's about the future. But look, some of the things we put in place over the last 4 years are long-term plans and were intended to take us past the 19th of March 2022 for years to come thereafter. So where that's relevant, I will discuss them. I'm also aware this is a mixed crowd. We have public educators, Catholic educators, independent school educators here. So I'll try and focus on areas that are universal to all groups. I'm happy to answer questions more specifically later on. But I want to start with first principles, as I often do. My ambition, I'm sure it's shared by pretty much everyone in the room. We want every child to thrive. We want every child to be supported to be their best self, whatever classroom or kindy, whatever town or suburb they're in our state. We want them to be their best, to lead a hopefully happy life, one where they find the opportunity to flourish according to their interests, their skills, their dispositions, their opportunities. In late 2019, for the 4th time, education ministers from around Australia came together in Alice Springs. It was a body of work that took place over the whole of 2019 and had input from thousands of educators around Australia, many of the people in this room. I was in Adelaide on the loudspeaker because Parliament was sitting, but other than that, everyone else was in Alice Springs and signed the Alice Springs Mabantwi Education Declaration. Tried to distill what were the shared values of education ministers across the country and hopefully educators across the country as well. And we decided that our vision is for a world-class education system that encourages and supports every student to be the very best they can be, no matter where they live or what kind of learning challenges they can have. It had two key goals. One was for the Australian education system to promote excellence and equity. The second goal for all young Australians to become confident and creative individuals, successful lifelong learners, and active and informed members of the community. Everything kind of comes back to those two goals and that vision across Australia in terms of the underlying principles of where our policy measures come from and our strategic measures come from. But lofty goals must be matched by resourcing. And of course, we've had a whole series of reviews of school funding over many, many years, arguments, disputes, and ultimately we have a set of measures which are imperfect, but better, I would argue, than any that have come before and distilled through the Gonski Agreement, the National School Funding Reform Agreement, which I signed along with Minister Tehan in late 2018. Funding to education has lifted dramatically and will continue to lift dramatically in the years to come as a result of that agreement, which is, of course, very, very strongly supported by all jurisdictions. This agreement unlocked significant new Commonwealth funding for both government and non-government schools. But to unlock that Commonwealth funding, what's probably less well understood is that it required a commitment of state governments, most state governments, not all, there were one or two that were already at the level, but certainly in South Australia, a commitment by our state government, a commitment which we had to extract from our state treasurer, God love him, to put into our budget papers an extra $700 million for public schools alone over the 10 years to follow that agreement. So investment in non-government schooling has increased, investment in public schooling too. And to give you a sense of how much that has grown over the last 4 years and how much it will grow in the years to come. This year, the 2021-22 school year, we are set for the first time to surpass $4 billion worth of expenditure in our public education system here in South Australia. That's up from 3.24 billion in 2017-18, and it's on a track currently budgeted as 4.496 billion in 2025-26. Very significant increase of $1.25 billion over that period. Now, if you exclude things like depreciation and revaluations that sometimes come into that, it's still a pretty significant increase from 3.1 billion in 2017-18, 3.8 billion this year, this financial year, to 4.27 billion in 25-26, a $1.165 billion increase. Large numbers. What does that mean from the state government? From the state government contribution in 2017-18, which was $2.7 billion. This year, it's $3.3 billion, an increase of $600 million, heading towards, in total, a $900 million increase in 25-26 when we get to $3.66 billion from the state government. Commonwealth funding over the same period of time has increased from $500 million to $700 million this year to $834 million in 25-26. They're the budget figures. That's public schooling alone. Non-government schooling has increased. Its increase from the state government has been in the order of about $50 million per sector from the state government. The Commonwealth figures I don't have to hand. Funding has also supported infrastructure growth. Now, obviously, a very significant component of that has come from, I think, three particular focus areas. The first, the sale of the Land Titles Office in 2017, prompted an investment of 692 million, sorry, a bit less than that, including some other land sales, about $700 million in infrastructure in public schools. And indeed, the infrastructure for new schools has been several $100 million as well. And the move of Year 7 to high school prompted a couple $100 million extra investment. Although it's to be noted that while the Year 7 to high school move, we needed to make sure there was sufficient room in our public schools for the Year 7s to come in. Not all of that expenditure is just related to the Year 7 move, because what we identified was the population bubble coming through our primary schools was also due to hit high schools. We had to create an extra 20,000 spaces in our high schools, about half of which were the year sevens and half of which were population growth, also accounting for some areas which had really specific areas of growth. I think that in the last 4 years, what we've seen in investment in infrastructure has been profound. And of course, while the massive increase in government investment has focused on public education, we've also seen for the first time state government investment to the tune of about $60 million in non-government schools as well. That infrastructure investment is important, but ultimately it's the teaching and learning. It's what the teachers do in the classrooms with the children that is tremendously important. Also impacting, of course, is what the children know and where they're at when they come to the classroom in the first place. Last year, we identified as a significant budget measure with about $50 million of investment identified, but growing at more than $16 million a year after the Ford estimates, the need for a greater focus on early learning. And that's got a certain impact in preschools, to be sure, and the work that's done in our long daycare centres is tremendously important in our family daycare workers. But also the way that our children's development interacts with broader government services is tremendously important. That early learning strategy, a significant new funding is going towards developmental checks. And that's for a reason, because we know that according to the Early Development Census, South Australian children have been going backwards in their vulnerability over the last decade. And that's not something that every state has experienced. Indeed, Western Australia, Victoria, Queensland, many jurisdictions, pretty much everywhere except the ACT in South Australia, have seen fewer children coming to school with developmental vulnerability. But South Australia, it's been going backwards from 2009 to 2018, when the last AEDC data we have, the next set due any minute now. We felt that with the Blue Book being absolutely known by everybody, but very few parents actually accessing subsequent developmental checks, there was work that needed to be done there, and best practice suggested that more needed to be available. So we are now working on a body of work that is designed to have far more developmental checks of all children in South Australia before they get to school, because we know that a significant equity opportunity is there for us to help more children get access to services earlier, before they're at preschool, before they're at school. There's a universal services available for them, whether that's in health or disability, or just the benefits of parents accessing more playgroups and other opportunities to support their skills. But those opportunities will be prompted by developmental checks. And so what we want to see in the years ahead is a very significant uplift in the access by parents to those universal services prompted by developmental checks. We want to make it easier for parents to gain access to those too. We're working on developing an app that will prompt parents to understand what opportunities there are in their area. We're looking at working with the Commonwealth and indeed other jurisdictions. We have our Blue Book, everyone has their different coloured book. So the Commonwealth, with our support, is now working on what we're calling a rainbow book. There will be electronic across, I'm serious, it was the only colour we could agree on. That will be working across all jurisdictions, so that there's some sort of opportunity for us to work together as a nation. Speaking of working with the Commonwealth in the early years, I'm really pleased that after, I think every single time I spoke to a Commonwealth minister for the first 2.5 to 3 years as the minister, I'd always make sure I got in there at least one plug. Have you got out of your Commonwealth Cabinet colleagues yet the commitment to ongoing funding for the universal access for 15 hours of preschool? And they knew it was coming, and they'd always say, not yet, but we're working on it. And to their credit, last year, the Commonwealth Government committed to ongoing funding for that universal access for children in the year before they go to school. And that's great. And we've now just secured in recent weeks the final dotted line. So that money is going to start flowing, and that's something that states and centres can bank on in the years ahead. It will help us in the work that we do. Also, as part of those negotiations, I raised with Minister Tudge, and we've secured a commitment from the Commonwealth to look at what we would call, in simple terms, out of school hours care in preschool. Because of course, 15 hours is really important for those children's education, but it doesn't always work with parents at drop off and pick up. And we have these workaround solutions, and many times a community children's centre, if it's nearby, will have the arrangement of sharing those children during the course of the day. But it makes it very difficult for a lot of children in a lot of areas. and our early learning strategy was very much focused on identifying barriers to access. This was one of them, and the Commonwealth's agreed to work with us on that. I'd like to thank Educators SA and its members for the way in which you've supported the work we've done in curriculum resources. The national curriculum is tremendously important. We've got in April, hopefully, an opportunity for all states to agree on the next iteration, which will reduce some clutter and ensure that we've got for starting to roll out next year in 24 for full rollout, that Australian curriculum updated and improved. But applying the Australian curriculum in a classroom context, especially for new teachers, has been so much enhanced in the last year and a half with the units of work that have been released, many of which have been written by people in the room through our curriculum and learning division. And those documents will continue to roll out every September in the years ahead across all of the R to 10 fields of study, and that's tremendously important. One of the things we did in the last 4 years, of course, was roll out internet fibre optic cables to every school to allow that reliance on utility quality internet settings, which is important for delivering the curriculum. Non-government schools benefited. I know that while the investment was for the public network, because that public network goes past almost every non-government school in the state, I know there are several dozen non-government schools that were able to then negotiate improved services with Telstra as well. And that enables us to get the most out of the opportunities South Australia has. We have in South Australia an expanding space sector, defence sector, cyber sector at a rate of knots completely incomparable to anywhere else in the country. And our digital strategy released at the beginning of this campaign is a $33 million investment, not only in helping students access devices and staff access devices, making sure that's a tool of the trade understood for every high school student and for more primary school students, but critically to weave that into the curriculum so that our children are on pathways towards accessing those amazing jobs that are open for anyone who wants to learn those skills. But while I'm speaking of skills, the other reforms that we've done in vocational education training ensure that funding from training is going towards job sectors where there are opportunities for employment. We also announced in the last few weeks $20 million to go towards careers counselling. I want South Australian schools to have the best career counselling services in the nation. And that careers counselling strategy, I think, will help marry up children's opportunities with their dispositions and skills in a way that really sets them up to succeed. Children with vulnerabilities are a key target area, and we've committed $15 million towards rolling out the recommendations that we've agreed to in the Graham report, which most of you would be familiar. We've got a joint plan of action with the Department for Education, the Department for Child Protection to support children under guardianship, which I'm very passionate about. We're working hard to ensure the Aboriginal education strategy fulfills its potential, where we want all learners to feel safe and supported in the classroom. And it's not just about getting children ready for school, but indeed ensuring our schools are ready to support those children, as Peter Buckskin says. Mental health, we've committed a $27 million commitment over the first 4 years, and that will expand from there. And indeed, I want to finish by talking about country education. Through this campaign, we've seen commitments to one aspect where there's clearly a bit of underdone service, and indeed the government's committed $2 million to the Catholic sector and $2 million to the independent sector and $8 million in public schools to improving buses. That's the period over the 4 years, that investment. And indeed, that bus service is critically important in country areas. That needs to improve. Our country education strategy released at the end of last year highlights a number of the key measures where we want to make sure that educators feel supported as they're coming into country communities, particularly if we can get them into placements during their teacher training period so that they know they can go into those country communities with confidence that they'll integrate well into a school, into a community. We want students in those country schools to be best supported, the opportunities across subject discipline areas as much as possible. We want those kids to be set up for success, just like students with disability, just like Aboriginal learners, just like all of those other learners with vulnerability, so that every child, every classroom or kindy is supported to fulfill their potential. That's our plan, and I thank you for listening so patiently.
Minister, for those online, I'm our disembodied voice off to the side, but we figured you'd prefer to look at the minister rather than me, so we'll go.
Rod's moved on from giving me the wind up to this.
Yeah. Yeah. So For the next 15 minutes, we're going to go on a journey that's been directed by the participants in the room. So the questions I'm asking are the ones that they wanted asked, and so I hope a little bit of the passion and excitement that came through the questions is evident when we go through this. I'd also point out that the Minister you haven't had any opportunity to see these questions, they're off the cuff. So if there's any further information or anything you wanted to send us later, we'd be happy to share that out with members as well. So the first one, you mentioned some extremely large figures to do with buildings and facilities, particularly around the transition of Year 7 into high school. The other one, we had quite a few questions from educators around the other facilities issue, which is the ageing buildings, etc., that are in many schools, and not only just schools, preschools, and also there was a question come in from childcare centre that was in a government-owned building. So the question they came out, what will your government do about addressing the facilities issues around the tired old facilities that exist in many places?
Look, that is a great question, and it's one that we've grappled with over the last couple of years, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk about it. It highlights something that I announced yesterday, actually, which was a $40 million commitment in the government system, identifying 20 schools that have some of the oldest and tiredest DMACs and old transportables that are in the lowest quality condition, but not necessarily at the end of their life. Identified as being those in greatest need of replacement, and we'll be replacing those over the next 4 years. But that is intended to be the start of a program where there'll be an annual budget identified, not necessarily just at expanding capacity at schools, nor fixing things that are at the end of their life, but actually just looking at retiring some of our oldest facilities that are no longer designed in the way that we teach the curriculum. Those DMACs from the 1950s, pre-1965, look, some of them have been refurbished and renovated and loved, and people make the most of the situation. But I remember talking to one teacher at a retirement event who was talking about, love the work that's going on in building schools and giving lots and lots of kids those great opportunities. But he'd always worked in small schools, and he hadn't worked in a brick and mortar building throughout the entire 43 years he'd been working, because he'd always worked in small schools. And I think that's understandable to an extent, because investment often follows need. So when you have, for example, not just the Year 7 project, but clear needs for expansions of a range of high schools, you'll see investment there. When we had the STEMworks $250 million in 2016, I remember I was in estimates. I was asking, how were these schools chosen? And it was basically, we wanted to get the best bang for the buck so that money could support as many students possible. That was my paraphrasing of the minister's answer. And it wasn't a bad answer. Of course you want to do that. You chase the urgent demand, growing areas, big schools. And the problem is, when that happens for decade after decade, you end up with the only other investments being like that which we put in at Langhorne Creek last year, where we're having to replace every building in the learning areas in the school because they were literally at the end of life. And at the end of this year, that school's going to benefit from that. But what we instead, this program that's been announced yesterday and which we'll be rolling out in the years ahead, if we have that opportunity, we'll see buildings retired before they're at that critical end of life stage. Now, that's not going to touch every building in the state that is in need of some support. Let's be realistic. We're talking about an enormous public education system. We've invested now in a grant program in the non-government school sector, so non-government schools can prioritise accordingly. The Catholic sector obviously is centrally managed. They've got a bit more flexibility, but in the independent sector, they're doing that well as well. In terms of what the government system will see, though, in the coming years is the opportunity that every year we'll have that regular budget allocation that will be there to see more and more schools added to that program of works, where they might not be an urgent need and they might not be running out of capacity, but they've got some really old buildings and those kids can get a bit better.
Great. This one is a definite amalgam of the whole series of questions, but it sort of goes to what a lot of people are feeling at the moment in the educator community. And it's a bit of a long-winded question. It doesn't have to be a long answer, but it's an important one. And many questioners have expressed concern about what they were sort of describing as the corporatisation of education, and a sense of a bit of a loss of the professional voice of educators within sort of systems leadership and throughout the system. They expressed concern that learning priorities have been reduced to those that can be tested, with the result that some areas of learning now sit a bit in the shade. So just sort of your reaction to that, your perspective on that situation and its validity, and maybe a little bit on how you'll ensure the voice of educators is strongly heard and acted upon in your next government.
Well, look, I thank you for the question. I understand the point that's being made, and people often talk about a reductive look at NAPLAN results as being an example of this. And there's a suggestion that that's the only thing people are interested in. I can promise you that's not the only thing I'm interested in. I mean, literacy and numeracy are important. Our literacy guarantee, our Learning Plus maths tutoring is designed to ensure all of our young learners are able to access those foundational key concepts. But its purpose is not to get great NAPLAN results. That's nice for politicians or leaders to look at, people feel good about. But their purpose of having literacy and numeracy skills strong in our children is for them to unlock the richness of a diverse curriculum at school, the richness of diverse opportunities in life. Hence, our support for the music education strategy, our support for languages in schools. Parochially, I speak as somebody who was absolutely fascinated by the performing arts as a young person whose university studies are littered with language studies and indeed the humanities tremendously important. Sometimes people talk about a focus on STEM or potentially on VET in schools, and those things are important too, because job pathways are a great outcome at the end of school for a young person to have a head start in life. But to have access to tremendous opportunities to either observe or participate in performing arts or physical education programs or the range of other areas that are so well represented in the Educators SA membership is critically important. Curriculum units of work that we're developing are across the entire field of work. When I go to schools and when I talk to the Chief Executive of the Education Department, regularly asking not just how the literacy and numeracy score is going, because they're readily apparent, obviously, but we're interested in what opportunities are there for children to engage in extracurricular activities. Have you visited the new Holocaust Museum that we've supported with our finances, or one of the History Trust museums that are now part of the Education Department? Have they had the opportunity to participate in youth theatre with Windmill Patch and indeed Carclew, now part of the Education Department framework as well? These are really important broader areas for children to have exposure to, and I think there's a good track record there which we can build on in the years ahead.
Thank you. And I'm just going to jump around in the question order a bit, because you opened the door nicely with NAPLAN. And yeah, we couldn't leave without a NAPLAN question. But there's certainly, as you'd be aware, differing views around it, from those who believe it's a major indicator of a school's effectiveness to those who see it as the tail wagging the dog. But there are a number of questions that went to broadening the way in which we view learning, and particularly developing indicators of education success that are aligned with the Mabantua Declaration. And so is there going to be scope to broaden those ways of viewing success at schooling, rather than, I guess, relying very heavily on NAPLAN solely or on SACE results? And, yeah.
I think that it's problematic only to talk about measurables. If you only talk about the things that you measure, then that's what people will chase. I try and encourage people not to focus only on those very tangible. Take NAPLAN, for example. So NAPLAN has had a number of people make suggestions about how it can improve. There was a report by Professor Loudon a couple of years ago, and education ministers have indeed taken up many of those recommendations in the way that NAPLAN results are presented, in order to try and take the heat down, because of course NAPLAN results are only a high stakes test if you put high stakes on them. Some people do, some people judge themselves or others by NAPLAN only. I think it can be a tremendously useful indicator of where extra resources may be needed. I think it can be very helpful in a classroom context. It's not very helpful when it's a 3-month turnaround. So I'm really pleased that we've now agreed that NAPLAN results next year, or this year, will be back in 4 weeks for everything except the writing assessment that is marked by humans, which will take longer. But we're not going to wait until that's done to get the results and everything else back. And next year it'll be 3 weeks, and then less, hopefully 2-week turnaround for those results. So it's more useful. Also, I can't say that there's you don't want to speak too much about what's happened inside education ministerial meetings, but there is indeed, I think, a groundswell of support, certainly supported by me, and I think an overwhelming majority of ministers, to have NAPLAN moved earlier in the school year, so that indeed it is something that I think coming early in term 2 There is an expectation, some people think there's an expectation that it will be a focus for term one, getting ready for NAPLAN. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be in any school. Apart from making sure children are comfortable in a testing environment, in my view, you shouldn't be teaching to a test. By moving NAPLAN earlier, it's argued, and I think persuasively, moving it to term one, you'll have less of the year focused on pre-NAPLAN and more time to actually look at some of the things the NAPLAN test raises.
Thank you. This is an interesting question I had to include. It's just a very short one. But if you're appointed to a different portfolio post-election, what would be the single most important piece of advice you'd give to your successor as Education Minister?
Get out of my office, I'm staying.
Perfect. Okay. Another, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll motor through these, but another one which came out a lot, and not surprising given the number of members we have interested in this area, but there were lots of questions around the teaching of languages, and there was a bit of perception coming through the questions that languages are struggling due to limited mandated hours were mentioned, and it's not always been seen as an important improvement priority within systems and within schools. How will your government take languages education forward post-election and ensure it is a priority?
Yeah, it will be a priority. It will remain a priority, and it's not an easy priority to address. There's low-hanging fruit, certainly, but without, I think some of the things that have benefited us in the past in encouraging the teaching of languages would be difficult to reverse. We're not going back to having 5 Year 12 subjects, of course, and encouraging students to understand that the study of a language to Year 12 is something that's not going to disadvantage them because of some perceived risk to their ATAR. It's going to be something that advantages them massively in every single job interview they ever do in the years ahead, and all of the benefits it will give the other aspects of their study. And having a lower number of Year 12 students, of course, means that there are fewer role models within schools to encourage younger children to pursue it. If it's something that's not studied at Year 12, it's not seen as something that is going to provide enough hours in many schools for there to be enough teachers to do that. And so teachers find their workload thinner. Indeed, and then of course, if it's not valued as much in high schools, it's not going to be valued as much in primary schools as well. It's not an easy circumstance to address, but it's one where we want to continue doing so. We want our children in primary years to have excellent interaction with languages. Our professional development work, and very, very significant sums invested in professional development in the last few years to ensure that our teaching community in our primary years are well set up to provide that. Every school I go to, pretty much, I talk to the principal about what language they offer. Do they create the space for it? Now that Year 7s are out of primary schools, I know many language teachers are glad to have their language room back. Some of them were moving from class to class. That environment where wonder and the identity, the imagination can flourish while the child is entering that language classroom should be nourished and encouraged. In the high school years, I'm particularly interested in looking at the nexus between those kids that want to study Year 12 or senior secondary languages and the availability of those languages. The School of Languages does a good job meeting some of those gaps. We've invested in ethnic schools to make sure that where there's an opportunity for those ethnic schools, or community language schools, I should say now, to take their studies to Year 12, then they do. But we want it to be mainstream in schools. We've now got 5 public schools offering the International Baccalaureate. Those students, and indeed I think there'll be over 100 of them this year, will all be doing language studies to Year 12 because it's a requirement. That in those schools is certainly meaning that there's a greater demand for language teachers. In other schools across the public school system, I am very confident that with the work that we'll do on ensuring that public schools are offering languages even to smaller cohorts, that will help. Because here's the thing, every school will offer physics or chemistry, specialist maths to a student who's interested in doing it. Language should be no different to that. It's not easy for principals always to make that decision, but I'll certainly be looking to work with our principals to make it easier.
I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to have to choose from amongst
I'll answer really quick.
Given the large, and these are big questions too, given the large teacher shortages being experienced by many schools at the moment, and the fact that so many teachers are leaving within their first 5 years of teaching, what strategies will you look at as a government to make teaching a more attractive profession, to, I guess, build the perception of teachers? And there's an adjunct to this in terms of this has particularly been, it's been felt everywhere, but it's particularly been felt in the country as well.
So the country education strategy has a number of targeted strategies to particularly address that question. I mentioned it before and it's there for everyone to read. I'm conscious of the time, I won't go over them. More broadly, teaching is a wonderful profession. There's nothing more profound than being able to influence a child's future and help them be set on a path to success. Celebrating our teachers is something I'm very passionate about and do whenever I can. I think that sometimes we talk about a shortage, it can be overstated. We had thousands of applications last year when we opened up nearly 1,000 new roles in high schools to go with the Year 7 transition. They were won by graduates, they were won by teachers who were on contracts, they were won by primary school teachers seeking to explore something in a high school environment that was potentially deeper at a subject level and something they were passionate about. And indeed, the positions where they were won by contact teachers have now been taken up by other teachers as well. There are some really hard to staff areas. We've supported the Teach for Australia program in their pilot, particularly getting people with depth subject expertise and knowledge into some of those country schools that have been advertising for a subject specialist teacher for years and unable to attract one. So that's a small token, 15 teachers, but they're doing really well. I think that there's opportunity to expand that program. But I do think critically that working with our universities on those placements, having as many as possible of them in the country is a really useful thing to be doing to help that work. And indeed, ensuring that when we have moments of challenge and disruption like we've had in the last 2 years, that we support our teachers as much as humanly possible to be able to be agile and continue focusing on students. We've tried to take away a lot of the unnecessary red tape from teachers, a lot of the admin over the last period, obviously the difficult challenges presented by COVID. That's something that's now a unit within the Department for Education's IT section of reducing red tape, and I think it will continue to show benefits.
Great. Really quick one to finish. If you were Minister post-election, after you've finished your next 4-year term, what do you hope will be your legacy, your key legacy?
I think that I don't want to focus on legacy, I focus on purpose. And if I've had an impact on supporting children and young people to be their best, to make sure our education system is financially supported and strategically directed towards successfully achieving that goal for our students, then every little bit counts. But a minister doesn't make an education system. We have 45,000 educators in South Australia who each interact with, over the course of their careers, hundreds, thousands of students and young people. Every single person in the room has people who, whether they're forgive me if I stray from my earlier commitment, whether they're pilots or craftsmen, or whether they are artisans, or whether they are teachers, the impact that you have is profound. And I think that no one person can possibly have a legacy that's more useful than that.
Minister, thank you very much for giving up your time in such a really busy schedule. We do have a gift of a very nice bottle of South Australian wine, which I'm sure might help you over the rest of the campaign, or you can share with a friend who would like it. So can you join me in thanking the Minister for his time? We're going to have a short break of about 2 or 3 minutes. So if you want to stand up and stretch in your spot, and then we'll start with the Shadow Minister. Okay, we might get started again. I hope everyone online's had a chance to refresh their coffee or whatever else they might have with them at this time. Just before I introduce our next speaker, I just wanted to make comment on the fact that we're actually really thrilled to be presenting this from the Hotel Grand Chancellor, because as you probably know, the hotel was one of the COVID hotels during the last couple of years. And I was one of those people who was under the impression that, that would have been easy. They didn't have to do much. It was pretty easy time for the staff at the hotel. And then when it reopened, the general manager, Tony Scrivener, did a post which was quite poignant. And he talked about the impact that it had on his staff over the 18 months and the impact that it had on him personally. And it actually brought home that it wasn't a holiday, it was a massive investment, and quite often at times when staff felt they were at personal risk as well as other things. So I just thought it was really important to acknowledge them giving something to our broader community. And therefore we, in that sense, were really pleased to be able to come here and show them some support by doing that. So a little side story, but I think a really important one. We continue now, and we're going to use exactly the same format as before. I decided not to repeat the questions exactly as they were, so I'm going to vary them a little bit and just personalise it a bit for the Shadow Minister. So I guess without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the Shadow Minister for Education, Mr. Blair Boyer. Welcome, Blair.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and could I begin by acknowledging that the land we meet on, of course, this evening is Gardner land, and I pay respects to their elders past and present. And could I also thank Lisa, Jane and Rod, not only for all your hard work over many years and all the other members of Educators SA as well, of course, but the opportunity to come and address your members tonight. It's not actually often as the Shadow Minister that you get these opportunities. One of the things I have found difficult in the about 18 months that I've had the portfolios is getting a forum or a platform, I guess, to actually talk about what our plans are. So as daunting as it can be to front a bunch of very experienced educators and take your questions, I do appreciate the opportunity, particularly given how close we are to a state election. And I want to say just, I guess, from the outset this evening that I don't for a second pretend that the announcements that the Labor opposition has made so far, and we have made a number in the education portfolios, constitute the sum total of what a Malinowskis Labor government would want to do in education if we are successful on the 19th of March. I've been around the education portfolio in one role or another, and there's many faces in this room that I know very well from my work as a advisor to previous ministers and Jay Weatherill as well. But I know that both major parties have often fallen in the trap, I think, of feeling before a state election or federal election that they must have a policy on absolutely everything. And I can tell you that the risk from opposition without the resources of government, without having the public service to brief you, without having the public service and all the other great stakeholder groups that are around you to do the modelling for you, there's always a huge risk that you make a very, very bad policy announcement and that hangs around your neck like an albatross for 4 years. And I should have also acknowledged the minister who's disappeared, but John has been very gracious in his acknowledgements of me over the last couple of years, and I should acknowledge the minister as well. And I'm sure he would agree with me that if you were to make a poor policy decision, that whoever the opposition of the day is, regardless of whether it's Labor or Liberal, they would certainly hold you to account for that. So there are really important parts of this portfolio that I know we are going to have to tackle very quickly, that we aren't going to make pre-election commitments on, because I think there is a huge risk that from opposition you make the wrong one and you make an ill-informed decision. Nonetheless, of course, I'm very happy to take questions on them later. Having said that, I'm proud that so far the Labor opposition has made a number of commitments in education. In fact, we actually began our process of announcing what we would do in government with the education portfolio back in October last year. Peter Malinowskis was very clear that despite, I think, what we can probably safely regard as a crisis in health at the moment, he wanted to start with education because our platform is about for the future. Peter is very passionate about it, as you would all know, I'm sure, the deputy leader of our party is Susan Close, who was a former minister. So education is well and truly central to what we want to achieve if we're lucky enough to win. So we started with education in October last year, and the first thing that we announced was that we plan to hold a Royal Commission into how we might deliver universal preschool for 3-year-olds. Now, I can tell you in this room that without a shadow of a doubt, we very much wanted that announcement just to be, we will deliver universal 3-year-old preschool. In fact, Susan and I did a lot of work with Peter to explain to him about why we maybe couldn't do that because of the complexity of delivering it. We have had questions since from people, fair questions about why we're having a Royal Commission, what will the cost be, etc. Well, the honest answer to that, of course, is it's an incredibly big change. Now, the transition of Year 7 into high school, I think, is fair to say is probably the biggest movement of staff and students the system has probably had, possibly forever. But if we are to successfully deliver universal preschool for 3-year-olds, that will, I think, be the biggest structural change really to how we teach our kids, even our youngest ones, in a very, very long time. I want to make sure that we get it right for all those reasons I set out at the start of my speech. And that's the reason that we have decided to hold a Royal Commission to make sure that we do it properly. People in this room will know some of the most complex issues in terms of delivering that commitment will be around capacity. Of course, it's easy to say we will have all 3-year-olds doing 15 hours of preschool a week. We need to find somewhere that they can do it. And we've been also clear, and in the spirit, I know Educators SA is a cross-sectoral group. We acknowledge too that we will look to work with the non-government sector as well in potentially how we deliver that. I know the non-government sector is very keen to be involved. That's a really good thing. We don't profess that we are going to be able to deliver it overnight, or that all the capacity that is needed for those 3-year-olds exists in the public system anyway. So that's another reason we have deferred to a Royal Commission. But nonetheless, I'm excited as someone who I hope in about 15 days might get a chance to, I've got to win my seat first, a minor technicality. But if that happens, and if we win government, and if Peter Malinauskas lets me stay in these portfolios, just a few minor hurdles to jump, I'm very excited that we have committed to this, because I don't need to tell you, you guys are experts in this area, but almost all the national, international data points to this being the most valuable, best bang for buck kind of thing that government can do in terms of helping our kids, not only in terms of academic achievement, but huge in terms of well-being as well. And I'm going to touch on the well-being stuff again later on. We've also announced a policy around teaching quality, not without some controversy. And some of the key parts of that commitment are increasing the percentage of permanent teachers by at least 10%, making the country loading that is given to teachers for going and taking up a spot in regional schools ongoing, and then incentives for teachers to gain qualifications in specialist subjects as well. 400 scholarships, or 400 scholarships for teaching degrees for a range of different areas, including high ATAR school leavers, men to study primary school teaching, Aboriginal people to study teaching, and women to study teaching STEM subjects as well. From memory, I think they might be 400 scholarships at $5,000 each to encourage people in those areas to get into teaching. We've also made a commitment around banning is a very strong word. It's always a trap for politicians to fall into, to use the word banning, but nonetheless, stopping financial institutions from running financial literacy programs in our school. I have my own experiences with what the Dolomite account did to me when I was in grade 6, and as you can see, I haven't let those go, and I intend on getting my revenge. And if I become the minister, we are going to stop those programs being delivered by banks, and we are going to work on creating a financial literacy curriculum that actually teaches kids the things they need to know. And you know, what they need to know has changed from when I was a kid. These days, they need to know things around mobile phone contracts and all that kind of stuff, how to understand a contract and how to understand just how the telco is fleecing you, because they are. It's just a matter of being able to work out exactly how they're doing it. And the first policy, in fact, that we announced when Susan Close was still the Shadow Minister was around stopping the use of mobile phones in schools, both the primary and secondary schools. The next major announcement we made was around technical colleges. So we have committed to building 5 technical colleges across the state, 2 in regional South Australia, and we have already announced the locations of those 2 sites. That will be Mount Gambier High and Port Augusta Secondary College. And we are also going to build 3 in metropolitan Adelaide as well, and we will announce the locations of those before the election. But I'm sure many of you are aware there are 3 very successful Catholic technical colleges already running. There is St Pat's in the north, there is Cardine in the south, and there is Western Technical College in Rosewater, which is the newer of the 3. But as someone who represents people in the northeastern suburbs, around the sort of Golden Grove, Windvale, Modbury area, I can tell you that parents and students at year 10 are voting with their feet and are electing the St Pat's Technical College model out there in really, really high numbers. And I know the Minister for Education is the Minister for Education for all South Australian school students. And I think it's important that not only having a Catholic offering in terms of technical colleges, we need to have a public offering as well. So we have committed to building 3 in metropolitan Adelaide, and I've reassured the Catholic sector that our intention is to put them in locations where they complement the existing ones. We do not want to go in there and steal students from those 3 fantastic Catholic technical colleges. Our idea is to place them in spots where people have choice, and collectively more South Australian kids get to choose that technical college model if they wish. The genesis behind this, Peter Malinowskis has certainly been keen on this for some time. My own experiences at school were certainly informative for me. I did all my schooling at Portland Secondary College, just across the border, so I'm an ex-Victorian. Don't hold that against me, but I know you all will. I started there in 1994, and just 12 months before that, the secondary college had been created from the amalgamation of Portland High School and Portland Technical School. And the amalgamation occurred on the technical school site because they got to use the trade wing. And I remember, and I might add to, my father was a teacher there for about 30 years. He taught English and history. But it was really powerful for me to see some of my classmates who weren't probably what you would describe as academically inclined, who really excelled in those trade subjects. And I remember some of my mates in year 7 who really struggled with things like English and maths. And that's one thing, but there was also, of course, the esteem issues that went with that, the disengagement from school that occurred that went with that, because they hated those subjects and they really struggled. And then they stepped into metalwork, into woodwork, and into automotive, and they were the stars of the class. And at the end of year presentation nights the school ran, they were up on stage with the kids who are getting academic achievement awards in maths and science and English, getting their awards in those trade subjects. And I know that some of my friends that I still keep in touch with only have their VCE because those trade subjects were still offered and it kept them engaged in school. And some of them, of course, did go on to be very successful with their trades. But as we know, some then needed that VCE for something that they did later in their life when they changed profession. And the only reason they actually had the VCE qualification was because the ability to study subjects which they were both good at and interested in at high school kept them engaged and kept them going there. And I know if they hadn't been offered at Portland Secondary School, they would have left probably in year 9 and sought employment or gone somewhere else. Finally, well-being, which I touched on at the start of my speech. And I know I don't need to tell anyone in this room the magnitude of the job that faces the next government in terms of tackling the issues that we have around poor mental health in our schools. And I know that the pandemic has obviously exacerbated this, and I think it's probably fair to say that we don't even know the full extent of it yet, particularly I think with the teaching workforce. I suspect they are. And I know we've got Andrew Gold here from the AEU tonight, and we've spoken about this. People are tired and worn out. They've been under immense stress for 2 years. A lot of them, I think, are probably running on empty, just waiting for this to be done. And I know kids, have in their own way, even the young primary kids, I have 3 primary age daughters of my own, have experienced a bit of anxiety around what's happening and understanding the virus. And we have made a commitment for an additional 50 million to employ a central pool of 100 new mental health and learning support specialists that will be deployed out to primary and secondary schools, and we hope provide the kind of timely and professional kind of assistance that not just students but staff as well might need. And this will include psychologists, speech and occupational therapists, social workers, youth workers, and other learning support specialists. So I think we currently have about 200 of the wellbeing officers in the department. This will represent an increase of 100. I don't for a second pretend that it will solve the problems, but I think it is the biggest single increase we have had in those areas. And I hope that it really goes some way to tackling the issues head on, not just for students, but for staff as well. And on that note, and just as I finish, I want to thank everyone in this room, but of course our school staff more broadly for what they have done over the last couple of years. At every opportunity I have spoken about my own feelings of guilt that I've felt when I've dropped my girls at the school gate or at the school doorstep, the classroom doorstep, and left them with teachers or SSOs who were asked to continue on the coalface in front of the students when other people had the option to work from home and they didn't. We really did ask people to go above and beyond, and they did it. And I think we all owe you a huge debt of gratitude for getting our students through that and our kids through that, and making sure that they were able to have a fantastic education despite the unprecedented situation that was going on around them. So thank you for that, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Shadow Minister. I was glad we were running out of time because I was starting to cross off all the questions I was going to ask you as you address them. I will say for our online viewers that if any of you watched Hey Hey It's Saturday, I've got to say I feel a bit like Dickie Knee. If you remember that, it was always under the bench or off to the side. So there is a voice coming to you without any picture associated to it. I think I know the answer to this question before you answer, but I'll ask anyhow because it's a really important one. And I think your answer will be Royal Commission. But your party's policy on the early years points out that we as a country underinvest in early childhood education. And we rank it says we rank towards the bottom of the table in investment, participation and dosage. And as a number of our members pointed out, despite this, our early years settings rank highest in Australia for exceeding standard. So I guess my question was around how will your government build upon the quality early years programs that exist, and I guess increase that investment and participation and dosage. And just as a bit of an aside, just to complicate the question, a lot of what came through was a fear that some early childhood settings would be increasingly schoolified.
Yeah.
So just your sense of the early years.
Very good question, Roy. And yes, you're right. To an extent, we will take advice from the Royal Commission, but nonetheless, you're exactly right about investment in the early years. In fact, one of the stats that Peter Malinauskas uses whenever he can, and he used it at a Master Builders Association luncheon yesterday, was the investment in early education that Australia makes and compared to other OECD nations. And I've just managed to find it on my phone. I think our OECD rank is 24th of 26 with 0.2% investment in pre-primary as a proportion of GDP. The average is 0.6. And in terms of 3-year-old participation in pre-primary education, Australia is 31st of 35 nations, 15%. The OECD average is 68.6%. So absolutely, we are dropping behind. And it's probably just one of many things that the Royal Commission has to look at. I know there are other things as well. And yes, I've had feedback as well since we made the announcement about our move to universal 3-year-old preschool, about not schoolifying the primary aid, that at the early years teaching and preschool. And I'm conscious though that there are countries, many of whom are in that OECD list, who have managed to do it in a way that doesn't schoolify preschool. And for all those reasons around how kids learn at that age, and I saw it with my own daughters in the community childcare and then preschool that they went to, and we don't want to lose that. I completely agree, but we do have a couple of other examples that we can follow overseas, and now also with Victoria having committed to doing it and starting to roll it out. So don't want to go in with any sort of locked in, predisposed ideas about how it would work, but you have my commitment that I don't want to lose that or inject too much of that schoolified kind of approach into it either, and that I acknowledge the value of not doing that and keeping it largely, or to some extent, play-based and stuff as well as it has been.
Thank you. An interesting question that someone was interested in. Why has being Education Minister important to you?
Well, my father was a public high school teacher for his entire career of 42 years, I think he did, in public schools that entire time, and stayed in the classroom that entire time. Did have the opportunity to go into the odd leadership role across his 40 years. I'm not professing he was going to end up being the chief executive of the Victorian Education Department or anything like that, but he had the opportunity, as you do when you stay at a school as many years as my dad did. And when I hear people talk about how teaching is a vocation, I always think of my dad. For Dad, it was a vocation. Now, in standing in front of kids and teaching them, he was completely passionate about, and he absolutely still is, and he does that with my daughters. And I'm very, very lucky after, especially in a job like this, where you spend a lot of time away at nights and evenings and events, and I get to go home and see Dad sitting at the kitchen table with my 3 daughters, teaching them like he did. But honestly, for me, in terms of a portfolio in cabinet or shadow cabinet, I never aspired to anything above education, and I feel incredibly fortunate that Peter and Susan gave me the opportunity. And who knows what happens in 15 days' time? It might not work out for me, but I feel incredibly lucky to have been given this opportunity, because to me, it was not only, I guess, the area that put food on the table for my family and the area that my dad spent his entire working life in, but it was also the issue that drove me to actually join the Australian Labor Party when I was 16 years of age. For me, it was all about support for regional and rural students. So I hope that goes some way to explaining why I'm passionate about it. I desperately hope I get the chance to actually be the minister at some point and do some of the things that we've committed to.
Your party's policy, this is going another direction now, your party's policy refers to our PISA results declining since 2000. This relates to a number of questions we received, one of which pointed out, interestingly, that fall in or decline in PISA results corresponds to a period of increased focus on data-driven improvement and NAPLAN. And there was that sense that while we focused more on that, the other ones dropped. So just, I guess, an opportunity, for your perspective on NAPLAN, and also linking it to that opportunity to broaden what we view as education achievement in South Australia.
I certainly don't think that NAPLAN is the one and only measure. And I think the minister actually made a few comments that I certainly agree with about the need for the education minister and the major political parties not to put too much of a focus on that. Unfortunately, we're stuck with NAPLAN now, whether you like it or you don't like it. And it's very hard to have conversations with parents, which I do on doorsteps about all sorts of things regularly, and say that we don't think there's a place for some kind of measure, whether it's the right one or not, into the quality of education that your children are getting. So we have to accept it. We've got it. For me, it is about trying to put as much emphasis on other measures around well-being as we do around the academic stuff. And I think to John's credit, he was very good and has been at these few debates we've done over the last few weeks at not being overly political and critical of my side. And I've tried to do exactly the same with his, because people are really fed up to the eyeballs of hearing that. But if I were to make one criticism, I guess, I think, and it's probably driven just as much by the department as it is by the minister, the laser focus on academic achievement and NAPLAN and things like that, I think has in some cases been to the detriment of our focus on things like wellbeing. And now with everything that's happened with COVID and all the pre-existing issues we had before that around mental health and young people dealing with anxiety and depression. I mean, I hear stories of primary age kids with suicidal ideation. Now, I've got to tell you, it really, really, really scares me. We have to find a way of putting a measure of those wellbeing things up on the same kind of pedestal where NAPLAN and PISA sit. Peter Malinauskas talks about PISA a lot because he uses it as a way of talking about the need for investment in our education system in terms of how it performs relative to other OECD nations. For me, I understand the link between the well-being of students and their academic achievement, and that one of the big things in trying to improve those PISA and NAPLAN results will also be addressing all those wellbeing issues that we do have in the classroom.
Might jump around a bit because I think it follows on a bit, and it's a similar question to we asked the previous speaker, and that's again the concerns that were expressed about what people perceive to be the corporatisation of education and that loss of professional voice of educators. So just an opportunity for you to talk about how you might engage educator voice as minister.
I agree with that sentiment. I think that has happened, and I want to see a move away from it. And I think, as an example, Rod, we have seen too many cases of things being outsourced to groups like McKinsey, including our roadmap to world class, which I might point out the other name for world-class, according to the reading I've done of the roadmap, is Estonia. That's what we've decided is world-class and where we're heading. But I do have an issue. McKinsey and groups like that are good at some things. I think once you get them into education, you're potentially left with some problems. And I think that we have had a bit of a corporatization of the department and the system, and a few too many examples of us outsourcing things that would ordinarily be done in the department to big consulting groups like McKinsey, and they look at things in a certain way. And everyone in this room knows that you can't just put a cookie cutter approach on education. It doesn't just work like that. And what you get is an outcome like the roadmap to world class, which I want a world class education too, don't get me wrong. But if you actually break the data down, it's in that McKinsey report, it's plucked a country like Estonia out and said that's what world class is, and we're going for that, because this completely data-driven approach that big consulting firms like McKinsey do, that's the only way they know it. So I think it is time for a bit of a shift back.
You touched on this a bit in terms of country education, and certainly we've got a lot of feedback from our country members that staff shortage, recruitment, all of those things are really hitting hard in the country, as well as curriculum provision. And you indicated that, given your background, country education is important for you. What are you seeing as some key actions you're taking in terms of the country?
And I remember really acutely, Rod, when I was at high school, seeing teachers that we loved leave. They came down from, well, we had some come from South Australia, we had some come from Melbourne to Portland Secondary School, and they were fantastic teachers. The kids loved them. Then they left because they wanted to start a family or go back to their family in one of the major metropolitan areas. So we lost them, and it just wasn't possible for the school to replace them. There wasn't another person like that regionally who could just take that role. So a couple of things I mentioned in my address to you was that we are going to make the regional loading for teachers who choose to go to regional areas ongoing. So it won't max out at 5 years. And we're going to increase permanency by at least 10%. We've chosen the at least 10% figure in consultation with the AEU because there is a disagreement there about what the figure of permanency is. So our commitment is whatever it is, we will increase it by 10%. And we hope that what that does, obviously it's easy to explain what we hope the regional loading will do. We hope that it will mean that people choose to stay in those jobs, but also reduce the churn in the system with people leaving at the end of 5 years service in the country and potentially then electing to use the right of return, which we will maintain, back to a metropolitan school where a contract teacher, for instance, is displaced to move somewhere else. So the feedback I've had regularly from principals when I speak to them is that they would like to be able to keep what they describe as the young gun contract teachers that they have, and they, I guess, train up and love, who are often moved on for a right of return to come back. Now, the only way to do that, I think, is to somehow reduce the churn in the system by having fewer people adopt that. We hope to do it by keeping the regional country allowance in place and by increasing permanency.
We had many questions coming around the issue of perceived inequities in funding to schools, and particularly in relation to government schools. From your perspective, do you see an inequity in funding? And if so, what might you do about it?
Well, I guess another area, Rod, where John and I disagree is on that deal that was signed up to in 2018. I don't think we would have signed up to that. I would like to think, and the commitment I'm making to people tonight, and that Peter and Susan have made in the past as well, is that we're not going to sign up to a deal which detrimentally affects any of our school students in South Australia. But in 2018, really, that was done. I mean, the decision to change the way that the money that was counted into the SRS, the Schooling Resource Standard, was calculated, ultimately meant that less of the money that was supposed to flow under the original Gonski agreement was going to come to schools, because some of the existing funding, I think, for things like transport and some other obviously really important education spending that is generally taken for granted, was allowed to be put into the calculations for the SRS, which meant that new money didn't need to come in instead. So I've made it very clear, I don't care who the federal government is, whether we have a Labor federal government or a Liberal federal government, we won't be signing up to a deal that shortchanges South Australian schools. And I think that might take a bit of fighting, but we're up for that.
Okay, great. This one's certainly linked to the wellbeing, and I had a number of questions around wellbeing, but I think you've talked quite a bit about that. And it's one relates to the connection to the outdoors and physical activity. And the question is talked about that we know that only 1 in 4 primary school children meets the physical activity guidelines. And so there was a question around what areas your policy will focus on improving children's physical activity and connection to the outdoors right across early years in school. And I guess linked to that is a consequent impact on wellbeing.
It's a good question, and I would put that well and truly in the category of one of the things that I'm not going to make a commitment on before election, because I don't profess to have a very good answer for it. I certainly accept the data. I accept we are struggling in that area and we need to do more, but it is such a complex area. It's the kind of thing that if the opposition made some kind of commitment, it would no doubt be one that if we were lucky enough to form government and got advice from all the stakeholder groups, they would probably advise us that it wasn't the right thing to do. But you know, this kind of stuff takes investment. I think Labor's track record in the past, and one of the questions I know that the Minister got was around old infrastructure and what was done. I'd like to put just a cheap plug in for what the previous Labor government did around building better schools, when we did commit $700 million for 91 schools to have some of that old infrastructure updated. We did put a lot of money into allowing schools to build nature playgrounds as well, things like that, which do encourage outdoor activity. And I think we'd be very keen to do exactly the same thing again, should we win. I acknowledge that it is a bit of a two-speed system in terms of infrastructure. There are certainly schools out my way, which were probably built in the 60s, which haven't had the upgrades other schools have had. And I've spoken to principals from those schools who would ordinarily be the kind of people who say it doesn't matter what the school looks like, it's what happens inside that counts, and that is true. But even they have said, we struggle in enticing parents in because they drive past and they say that school looks bad. And they say the principal's heard those stories and acknowledges that you've got to spend a bit of money to make it appealing for parents to get in there and students and staff to teach in the first place. So I think absolutely we'd be keen to continue that work and acknowledge that something needs to be done around physical education and encouraging it more.
The legacy question. So you know, on the assumption that the party's successful and you're the minister, 4 years' time, you know, what would be your sense of this is, you know, we've been really successful at leading education?
We've spoken a bit tonight about wellbeing, and I also agree with the minister that it isn't about legacy, and it shouldn't be. But everyone, of course, reflects on their time in any kind of role and looks back at what they've done. But I would like to see us make some kind of improvement in terms of support for kids who have, whether it's issues around mental health, support for kids and parents who have a disability to get the access to the assistance they need in schools faster, and I think with less fuss and angst than we currently have, because what I hear a lot of feedback from, just as a member of parliament, not as the shadow minister, are people who have kids in the system with a disability who feel like they have to wait an inordinate amount of time to learn whether or not they're going to be placed in a disability unit or whether they're going to get the extra support they need. And that is incredibly frustrating and demoralising for them. And I think particularly also in terms of kids with ASD on the autism spectrum, more needs to be done there, I think, in terms of how we better care for them at school. There's always going to be a big argument, I know, around mainstream or not mainstream, and there'll be parents who always disagree with what it is the department thinks is the right thing to do. But just like I hear stories from kids with disability, I hear so many stories from parents with kids who have autism that they aren't happy and they feel like their kid is being left in the corner of a mainstream class because the supports aren't there to make sure that their kid has the education. Now, to me, that group of sort of three lots of people in terms of their mental health, disability or autism are probably the ones who are really being left behind at the moment. I'd be very happy that if I get to be the minister and at the end of the 4 years, I could look back and say that we've done something to help those people, because I think they haven't had the support they've needed for too long now.
Shadow Minister, thank you very much again for giving up your time in what is a frantic pre-election time. Originally, this was going to be on the 2nd of February, but the COVID situation at the time made that impossible, and it perhaps would have been a little more relaxed than currently. So again, thank you for showing that you value educators and to be here and share with us. And again, could I ask Anne if you could present as a bit of a thank you, a nice, very nice bottle of South Australian wine from a very nice small winery. So we hope you enjoy that.
Thank you. I shall. Thank you, Rod.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
And just to finish off, if you're like me now, you're probably wishing we had about another hour and an opportunity to ask lots of questions, because whenever you have a conversation like this, you can think of something you want to go deeper with, you want to get greater clarity on. But there wasn't time available tonight. So what we've tried to do is give you an opportunity to sit, as I said at the start, to sit, listen, form your own opinions. And it's now the opportunity to go away and do your own research, read the policies or whatever, prior to the 19th of March. Don't vote on the 16th of March, that will not work. Vote on the 19th of March. Thank you all for coming along tonight, both online and also within the room. We got agreement from both the Shadow Minister and the Minister to record this event. So we will look to put it up on a link up on our website very soon. It won't be an edited version. It will be the whole version. So we're not going to edit in any way. There's not time, and we think it stays true to the actual conversation to have it up there. But if you and your members or colleagues want to have a look at it who are unable to be here tonight, that's certainly an opportunity to have it out there. Just a very quick thank you to all the Educators SA staff team. I can see Jamie down the back and Jade somewhere around. And also Anne is down the back, who put a lot of time and effort into organising this and making sure it was a good experience for everyone here. I also want to comment on some of you, when you registered, would have noticed the opportunity to make a donation. And the Educators SA board has decided to start up at a small scale something called Educators Care. And that's just a way in which whenever we hold an event, and if our members want to do the same, it gives the opportunity for people to donate $2 or whatever. And each year we'll choose a charity that's focused on children to donate to. So everyone who donated for this and the forthcoming meetings, all that money will be going directly to Backpacks for SA Kids, which does a great job of providing kids in need with some essential requirements to enable them to engage in school. So I think that's a really exciting new initiative that the board's come up with. And again, it just reinforces that as a profession, we do care and we continue to contribute to children beyond our normal roles, but in other ways as well. So again, at this stage, just with small donations, we're up to about $280, which I think is fantastic. And certainly by the end of the year, we're hoping that's a sizable sum that will help to go support that organisation. So just to finish off, again, thank you everyone for coming. I hope you've enjoyed the evening. I hope it's given you a chance to sit and think about what you've heard, and therefore, from an educator point of view, make the decisions you need to make in terms of the policies going forward. Good night, everyone. And you need. My pleasure. That ends the event. For those who are currently here, there are some very nice drinks downstairs if you wanted to stop and relax and talk about things on the way out. Otherwise, have a good night. Thank you, everyone. And I know our speakers have done this. I think educators have done an incredible job this term under really trying circumstances. And on behalf of everyone in education, thank you for all you've done. And we hope the rest of the term is really safe and successful. So thank you, everyone.